Hey guys, Coach Chris here, back with another video. So excited to bring this one to you because in this video, the pride of Jackson Chess returns. Our very own Drew, who's off at Mizzou, played in a tournament this weekend and sent me the games. Really excited to go over them with you guys, and I hope you enjoy them as much as I have. So Drew starts off the tournament with 2 whites, which is pretty cool. Opens with d4. We get a London, so typical London move so far. d4 to take the center, bishop f4, combined with the d4 pawn, really clamp down on e5. Black plays c5 to start counterattacking in the center. e3 solidifies the center, makes it possible to develop the bishop. Here, Black plays an early captures line, which is interesting. I don't see that too often, but it's totally viable. Drew recaptures with the pawn, of course. You don't want to recapture with the queen because then that runs into knight c6 developing with tempo. So e takes d4, knight c6 developing towards the center, pressuring the d4 pawn, so c3. Very typical London setup. The minor pieces belong on the squares. Black plays knight f6, and here is the first moment where I slightly object to Drew's move order. Here, I would strongly prefer that bishop d3 be played right now, because Black's next move in this position, we know that Black's next move is going to be either bishop f5, bishop g4, but it's going to be one of those moves. So that then Black can play e6, develop the bishop somewhere, castle. So we know that next on the agenda for Black is to develop the light square bishop. If we don't get in bishop to d3 now, we won't ever get it in. And like I've talked about before, in the London system, when you're playing against a traditional d4, d5 setup, meaning you're not going against a fianchetto structure where a bishop on d3 would not be so effective because it would just be biting on granite. When you're in a traditional classical pawn structure, your light square bishop belongs on d3. And so here, instead of knight to d2, I would have preferred bishop to d3 so that we guarantee that our bishop gets to its desired square. What happens in the game? Well, let's just take a look at this real quick. Then if bishop g4, then we don't have to walk into that pin, although we could. We could play queen to b3, targeting the weakness that Black just left behind whenever Black developed the bishop to g4. So I would prefer to see bishop to d3 here, not a huge deal. Position is still totally fine. I would just prefer to get our London set up where possible. And here Black plays bishop f5, denying us our chance to play bishop d3. So Drew develops the other knight towards the center, getting closer to castling. a6 from the opponent. Queen b3, a very typical move in the London and in queen pawns games in general. When that light squared bishop comes out, very often it leaves the b7 pawn weak, and so white can attack it with the queen. Queen d7 to cover the pawn, which is interesting. Drew immediately jumps in with knight e5, which is totally fine. Whenever we see a queen on d7, we need to be aware that knight e5 often comes with tempo, and also there is a potential fork here on the b6 square, which, if you can get a knight to c4, you can get into that square. So when there's a queen on d7 and a rook on a8, be mindful of that potential tactical theme. So knight e5 takes. This is the correct recapture this time. Often when Black has already castled kingside, and whenever we've got a menacing bishop on d3, we often capture with the pawn so that it kicks out Black's king's best defender. But in this position, that's not the case, so bishop takes e5 is correct. e6 from Black, bishop e2, and here we sort of see this is the sad reality of missing our chance to play bishop d3 earlier. Bishop e2, totally fine. It's really the only square we've got. bishop b7, castles, castles. And now here is the second moment where I don't love Drew's move. You know, c4 kind of looks like it's necessary. How else is white going to get play? However, it leaves the d4 pawn particularly weak, and it opens up the d5 square for the opponent. So it's tough, but in this position I would try to be patient. So here the plan that I like the best, I would want to play something like a4, a5, clamping down on the b6 square so that black can't get a minority attack going, leaving us with a weak pawn on c3. So the a4, a5 plan is definitely a thing. You can also just play quiet, developing moves, try to slowly improve the pieces. Our pawn structure is pointing to the king side, and so that would tend to indicate that we want to play on the king side. We don't really have pieces there yet, but you know, after we clamp down on black's potential counterplay and we make sure there are no problems there, then we could start slowly migrating our pieces to the king side. So that's another potential plan. Drew went with c4 here. Drew, I've noticed, really likes c4 in the London, which is fine. The engine says it's okay. It's just not my particular cup of tea. Black takes, again, exposing the d4 pawn and the d5 square. And here Drew takes with the bishop, which is inaccurate. We wanted to find a way to get a knight to b6, and this was our moment. Knight takes c4, connects to the e5 square, connects to the b6 square. Sometimes there's also knight a5, which puts annoying pressure on this pawn, and if it ever has to move, then you know, after we've got a rook on the c file, then the knight can jump into c6. So knight takes c4 was the way to go. Drew took with the bishop, and unless white is immediately shedding the d4 pawn and getting rid of this isolated pawn, then the bishop doesn't really belong on c4 because it's not really doing anything. These pawns are solid, so taking with the knight to connect to these juicy squares was the name of the game there. Black played knight g4, and here I like Drew's choice to improve the worst placed piece, knight f3, and after takes, I really like that we're able to get rid of that isolated pawn on an open file and play d takes e5. So black has the bishop pair advantage. We've got a little bit more space. Our rooks are very quick to the center, and they're going to come with tempo. So engine very, very slightly prefers black. I think white's just fine. So bishop c5, rook to the middle, hitting the queen. Queen moves away, and now here Drew starts to double, which makes sense. The engine thinks that we should just immediately challenge black's light squared bishop and deny black the advantage of the two bishops. Also makes a lot of sense. But Drew starts by doubling, and we get a rook trade. Rook c5, which I'm not really sure what the idea is. Maybe black is, you know, thinking about trying to set up some sort of discovery and taking that sort of loose bishop on c4. But Drew plays bishop d3, challenging the bishop, and here Drew retook with the rook. I definitely would have taken with the queen here. Now the d file is ours. The rook can't come over to challenge it. And what we've done is we've taken a couple of moves for our rook to get to d3 in this position. So I feel like queen to d3 was the way to go there. Rook d3 is fine. So bishop a7. We do need to watch out for potential back ranks. You know, right now we're still okay-ish. It'd be nice to create some left very soon. Queen d1. So it's interesting. Now we've got a battery on the d file, and our rook could come to d7 with tempo. So This must have been the position Drew had in mind whenever he recaptured with the rook. So very interesting plan from Drew there. So queen d1, opponent creates some left so the king's not getting back ranked. That's smart. And Drew does the same. Typically, whenever your opponent has a dark squared bishop, the flight square, the left you want to make for your king, you would typically want that to be on a color complex opposite your opponent's bishop. So, for example, if we get into an endgame where this pawn falls, or the dark square bishop has access to the f4 square, then h2 is not a true flight square for the king because the bishop would control that color complex. So Drew also could have thought about g3 here, creating a flight square on a light square. The downside to that, though, of course, is white is putting pawns on dark squares, and as we get into an endgame, when we have pawns on both flanks, as we get deeper into an endgame, the bishop will become more powerful than the knight, and we would prefer to have our pawns on light squares if we had the choice, so that if everything gets traded off, black's dark square bishop is not just devouring all our pawns. So tricky position there. Engine says h3 is fine. I'm a little concerned about our king safety, but I totally get that we're getting closer into an endgame, and so we would like to have our pawns on light squares if we could. We got a lot more moves to cover, not a whole lot of time. This game is so rich, so interesting. I will try to find a way for you guys to be able to analyze this on your own, because there's so many lessons in here for us that I just can't possibly cover in one short video. Queen c5 from the opponent. So notice that he's got a strong battery aiming at f2. Engine gives just a really crazy line starting with rook d8 check. Let's just skip over that. Queen d2 keeps everything covered. Queen c1 with the check, but we can block with the knight. Black captures, which, typically when your opponent's king is a little bit weaker than yours, you don't want to trade queens, so I'm sure Drew was happy to see the queens off the board there. There's no real back rank problem because the king can just slide over and defend the knight. And so now we get a very interesting endgame. When you get down to an endgame, especially a rook endgame, activity is key. You can't defend passively. It is far better to be active and allow some of your pawns to fall if you can take some pawns of your opponent. That said, we'll hopefully see deeper in the endgame where sometimes you do have to just cover your pawns. Endgames are tricky. They often defy hard and fast rules. Chess is tough. You gotta address the concrete position in front of you. So rook d7, bishop b6, which is a curious move. With rook d7, Drew was saying, I want to take the pawn on b7. Well, now we get to do that with a tempo. The bishop has to move again, and Drew starts to bring the king out. Right now the b2 pawn is protected for the moment. Opponent played rook a8, and here, this was move 32, so I'm sure Drew was low on time, but we had a glorious, glorious opportunity to just win the game instantly with knight c2 with a fork. Now again, I'm sure Drew was in time pressure. c2 is not a square we typically see knights on, so I totally get missing this tactic, but one takeaway from all of our games is that we all need to keep grinding those tactics, and so here Drew had a chance to finish the game immediately. Played a3, which we can't really hang on to all the pawns, and so not sure about that decision. Bishop takes e5 and knight d3, so now we're defending the pawn and hitting the bishop. Bishop moves back. Rook a7. And unfortunately I'm going to have to leave it here, guys. We get to a really, really fascinating rook and pawn endgame that I would encourage you to analyze for yourselves. Maybe I'll try to post all the moves in the description. Anyway, thanks for watching. Keep grinding those tactics. And Drew eventually got the draw in this position.